what is your thought on humans studying humans and applying intellect to assess human behavior or patterns in that? Do you think there's value in it, or are we just creating more of those mental models?
It depends. It depends what one is looking for. If you look at, for instance, if you take the example of the academics' sole goal is to publish, right? Because that's how they get promoted. So the game is rigged from the very beginning. It's sort of like the media. Well, the media publishes sensationalism to sell hot dogs. Why? Because their goal is to sell hot dogs. So there's no reason to blame them for that. That's their goal. The newspaper cannot run unless it sells. So it sells when its content is read. So therefore, they will do whatever they can to sensationalize and make stuff up, or dress it up in ways that makes it appealing. So once again, there's no blame there. That's their goal. Their goal is to sell newspapers. In the same way, but if one recognizes that, then one also recognizes that source cannot be trusted, because the goal from which they function is not pure. Right? It doesn't mean that it should be pure. It just means that it's not. And by virtue of the fact that it's not, means that calls into question all that they do. In the same way, the academic's primary goal is to publish, period. The more papers that they put out, the higher the possibilities of promotion and tenure. Therefore, what is published in so-called peer-reviewed research journals, a lot of it is not true. So some of it may be, but how will you know by sifting through all of that in these kind of so-called scientific research and studies into human behavior, what is true and what is not? What is true is often much more relevant and much more gleanable by doing one's own experiments, because they are not, if they truly want to know, then they are not bound by a covenant which compels them for an ulterior motive that is not pure. So intellectuals like intellectualism, and they believe, like the scientists. Now, it doesn't mean that science has no relevance. It does. Science has relevance in society. But in the matters of truth, be it truth about the mind, truth about human emotion, the truth about arriving at peace, the ultimate questions of life, the things that humans truly, genuinely, deeply search for, those cannot be touched by science. Those cannot be touched by the intellectual, because the intellectual and the scientist can only measure those things that are recognized and measurable within test tubes, within laboratories, within their so-called pyramids and fancy diagrams and pie charts and words and concepts like intelligence quotient and emotional quotient that are created out of thin air simply for their own benefit, to make them sound smart. All that an intellectual talks about is really targeted and for the consumption of the intellectual. It feeds himself. It feeds his ego. It isn't real. So in the same way that if you discuss what happens to, for instance, an individual when they come into an emergency room, you can separate each thing out as to put the IV in first and then stop the bleeding over here and then give this kind of saline and do this and this and that. But all those things are happening simultaneously. They only happen separately within the classroom. Now, it is necessary to break things down for the purposes of understanding and to relay what happens. For didactic purposes, it is necessary, but it isn't real. It isn't reality. So one may excuse themselves and be excused by reducing reality into concepts that can be taught in classrooms and in lectures and intellectual conversations. But the only reason that that can be excused is because the human beings insist upon having classrooms and upon having intellectual conversations. If human beings were interested in truth, there would be no intellectualism. There would only be the direct thing. And talking around it and creating egoistic names that sound nice, like emotional quotient, to feed their own sense of self, wouldn't exist. I think the study of masses reveals the behavior of masses. But no masses in the history of anything has ever achieved anything at all otherworldly or lasting. Therefore, you can study a herd of cows and you can find out that they eat grass at 12 noon. But if you are looking for things that are ultimate or genuine or true, you won't find them by studying herds. In fact, what the individual what you will find in the individual who does achieve such otherworldly things is actually thought and behavior, which is completely opposite to that which the studies show. So it depends what one is looking for. If one is looking to look out upon the landscape and describe the behavior of roaming cattle, if that has relevance to them, then they can. But it has no meaning for an individual who is looking for truth.